We're, a little over, I think, halfway through. There it goes with one slide. Okay, I see how you're going to be this year. We're a little over halfway through with our study of the book, Supernatural. And I had run out, but I've got a couple more in. So if you need one, or if you would like to pass one of these books on to a friend or something, let me know. I've got a few of them laying up here on the front row. But we're up to chapter 8 today, and it is entitled Sacred Space. And here's just a really brief outline of that chapter, talking about God's holiness, and we're going to talk a little bit about recreating heaven on earth, as it were. And so we're going to dive into that now. We've talked before about this idea of holiness. We want to explore it a little further this morning. Think back to when Israel is in Egypt. They're in bondage. It's right before the Exodus. How did they know about God? Well, they had always heard the stories that had been passed down through the clans and through the families and all that kind of stuff. And they knew about God's call of Abraham. Obviously, they had heard the creation stories and things like that. But they'd never really, once you get past, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there's really no record of God interacting directly with his people until he talks to Moses. And so Israel at this point had not experienced God. They had heard of him. They knew the stories. They had not met him. And so that's what's going to happen after they leave Egypt. That's what's going to happen at Sinai. And they got to see God in action as they're leaving Egypt. There's the Egyptian gods, and I am firmly convinced that they are supernatural beings of some kind, but they're certainly not Yahweh. They cannot stop his plan. He is going to succeed, and in fact, he deals them a very heavy defeat in the plagues and stuff, and he rescues his people. And so they then go to Sinai. And it's there that they're going to learn what it means to be the people of God. We read the passage in Deuteronomy 32 where it basically says God, divided up the nations and kept Israel as his portion. Well, it's at Sinai that Israel is going to figure out what that means. What does it mean to be God's people? And it's going to be based on this idea of holiness, of being set apart. We've talked before about the idea of the word holy. And of course, we always use it in a religious context, a God context. But the word itself means set apart or somehow different. It's special. It's not used for ordinary purposes. It's different. And God is going to try to teach Israel that he is different. He's not like these other gods, and Israel is not like these other nations. And he's going to do that through what we would call rites and rituals. This is going to be the basis for all of these really weird rules that Israel has to follow. You look through Leviticus and you see all the rules. When you go to tabernacle, when you go to temple, you wear this set of clothes, not this set of clothes, and you do these things to go to tabernacle, stuff that you wouldn't do. Why all this weird stuff? Why all these rules? Well, it's all about drawing near to God, and he is different. So somehow we have to become different. We can't carry the pollution of the world into the presence of God. And so that's sort of what's going on, and we're going to explore some of those concepts this morning. Yahweh, God, the one creator God, is, and the Hebrew word is Elohim. He is a spiritual being. And I'm saying that to say he's not a person. He's not a mortal. he has appeared that way. You know, you go back and you read the Abraham stories where God walks up and Abraham says, you know, here, sit here, let me feed you a meal and all this kind of stuff. And God gets encountered in that form, but he does that so that people can begin to comprehend him. That's not what he is. And so here he's going to try to teach Israel more about him. Leviticus 19:2. Speak to all the congregation of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. That's a tall order, but that's what we're getting at. I'll read it in a little bit different language. Speak to all the congregation of Israel and say to them, you shall be set apart. You shall be different. You shall be other. Because I, Yahweh, your God, am set apart, am different, am other. So that's the goal that he's getting at here. And we look at a lot of these rules and we think, oh, it's all about Israel's morality. God's trying to teach them to behave. And yeah, that's part of it. But I think it's, and the more I read this, the more it comes out to me, I think it's less about morality and more about being different than the world. The world behaves this way over here. We don't do that because we're different. I mean, that's true for us too. We can look around at the world and we can see the way the world behaves, but we're God's people, so we behave differently. The behavior is not the point. That is just the way you can see it from the outside. It has to do with them being distinct, them being different. And so God enforces or reinforces this in the minds of Israel, and he does it through ritual and worship and sacrifice. And it's because he's trying to bring the purity of his presence into the impurity of the world. You think about when God created the world, back in Genesis 1 and 2, everything was perfect. It was exactly the way it was supposed to be. And he was in Eden. People were in Eden. There was a community there. And then that gets messed up. The world gets corrupted. The world becomes a place of imperfection, of death, of decay. And because that's not the nature of God, he can't be there in the same way that he used to. And so his realm is more one of the supernatural, of the non-material. We live in a very terrestrial, a physical world. God is not physical the way we are. Somehow the place we live, the space we inhabit is common. It's ordinary. The word that you'll often run across in this context is profane. Now, profane doesn't mean what we think of when we hear like the word profanity, bad language. Profane means common or ordinary. It's the opposite of holy, which is special and set apart. We live in ordinary place. And Yahweh, God, the Creator, is the exact opposite of that. That's how he is other. And so for us to go into his presence, for Israel to go into his presence, he calls them into his presence, and then they have to be clean, or what's the word I use? Purified, to go into God's space, because you can't bring the uncleanness of the world into a holy place. So let's talk about uncleanness for just a second, and we're going to hit the big two that people often look at these rules about. I'm going to use a couple words that you don't usually use in church here. The uncleanness that we often read about and people get really upset about has to do with sex and menstruation, or just blood in general. But this is usually if someone is going to complain about something in the Old Testament, these are the two that show up. The rules are not there because Israel is somehow squeamish, and that Israel is somehow prudish about all this, and we don't talk about that, we don't do that. It has to do with life. the creation of life, the sustaining of life, and the parts of the body that have to do with life. And when you lose those bodily fluids, somehow part of life has gone with it. That's the idea that God's getting across here, because as the giver of life, anything that is associated with losing life or death or anything like that can't come into his presence. And that's why blood is such a big deal for Israelites, because it represents life, except when it's lost, and then it represents death, and death and God don't come together. That's the underlying thing, the underlying reason for some of these rules. It's the same idea, the same reason why there are prohibitions in the Old Testament about handicapped people coming into the presence of God. You know, if you are missing a hand or missing a foot, you can't go into the tabernacle. You can't go into the temple. And it's because somehow there's a loss of the perfection that God created. And that imperfection cannot go into the presence of God. And so these rules, these regulations, these rituals have to do with bringing the totality of Israel, the whole community, into an awareness, not just that God is, but that how different God is from us, and how different God is from all of those other spiritual beings that are going to be competing with him. You know, that's going to plague Israel for the rest of our history. It plagues the world that there are these other spiritual beings that are wanting to compete with God for our attention. So, let's talk about where God is. That's the idea of sacred space. God lives in the tabernacle, temple. I'm going to use the two words kind of interchangeably, but I think we know our history. The tabernacle was the first place that Israel built for God to live. It was the portable one. Temple comes later, and temple is just sort of a permanent structure that mirrors the tabernacle. So either of those words, and I'll probably bounce between the two. It's where God lives. God came down and inhabited the tabernacle. He came down and inhabited the temple. He was there in some kind of physical aspect. Okay, I get it. God is ethereal. God is everywhere all the time. But he was somehow in the tabernacle in a way that he wasn't in some other places. And of course, we know that where God is holy. I mean, go back and you read Exodus where Moses is at the burning bush. And God says, take off your shoes because this is holy ground. Why is it holy? It's holy because God's there. You go later into the book of Joshua, where Joshua encounters the commander of the Lord's army, which seems to be a manifestation of God. And the commander of the Lord's army says, take off your shoes because this is holy ground. Well, what do those two places have in common? The bush and the place where the commander of the Lord's army is standing. It's the presence of God. So it is God's presence that makes something holy. And so when God inhabits the temple or the tabernacle, that is sacred space. That is holy ground. And if you read the texts carefully, and we're going to look at a couple of pieces of imagery here, there's Eden imagery going on in tabernacle, in temple. I'll tell you a little bit about some ancient worldview stuff. In the ancient Near East, their worldview, and this is not just Israel, this would be any ancient Near Eastern culture. If you say, where does your God live? They're going to use three pieces of imagery to describe where God lives. Typically, they will say that gods live in tents. I don't know why, it's just everywhere. Gods live in tents. And those tents are typically in gardens. Okay, Eden is a garden, we got that. Or they also live on mountaintops. And sometimes it'll be in a tent, in a garden, on a mountaintop. I mean, that's just the imagery that all of the cultures of that time and place used for their gods. And so now you get Israel, And they recognize here is the tent where God lives. Those two ideas in their head just fit together. And if you want to encounter God, you go to the tent where God lives. We do some of that same stuff. We have some of that same imagery. Now, if you pressed any of us in this room, we would freely admit the church building is just a building. It's not special. It's just wood and plaster and glass and all that kind of stuff. God is no more here or no less here than he is at the grocery store. If you pressed us on it. But listen to our language, particularly our language in dealing with our children. When you go to the church building, don't you act like you normally act. Don't run in the church building. Don't yell in the church building. Put on these special clothes when you go to the church building. We almost have that idea that God is here in a way that he's not there. And there are other Christian traditions that even pull that idea in a little stronger. So we're not immune to the same idea that Israel had, that if you want to encounter God, you go to the place where God lives. But they came by that fair and square. Let's go to Exodus 25. Exodus 25, verse 9. Moses is up on the mountain, and God is talking to him, and God says, exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and all its furniture, so shall you make it. God says, I'm going to give you the design for building this thing. Verse 40, same chapter. And see that after that you make them after the pattern for them, which is being shown to you on a mountain. There's this idea here that God has this place where he lives, and he describes it and shows it to Moses, and then Moses goes and recreates it on earth. And so the tabernacle is a copy of God's heavenly dwelling place that is recreated on earth. No wonder for the Israelites, that's where you go to encounter God. That's his house. That's holy space. And so you do things differently in God's presence. And even the furniture is Edenic. You know, we read about the lampstand, and this is, where is it? Exodus 25. Down in verse 31, you shall make a lampstand of pure gold, and he goes on for several verses to describe the lampstand. And if you pay real close attention and sort of draw it out the way it's described, you're going to look at it and go, I recognize that. That's a Jewish menorah. You know, the 7-branched lampstand that, you know, we just had Christmas, and so there was also Hanukkah. And if you were at the store looking at cards, you probably saw some Hanukkah cards. And it has the lampstand. That's what they built. But if you read the language, it talks about branches, and the cups, it says, are made like almond blossoms and flowers. It's using tree language. And that, for an Israelite, thinking about trees where God lives, you're back to garden imagery, and you're back to tree of life in Eden imagery. And then there are, when they build the Ark of the Covenant, it says there are cherubim that sit on top of that. Cherubim are sort of these spiritual angelic beings. And of course they show up in the Eden story too. Now they're there to keep us from getting back to Eden. It's a guard, but they're there. And if you ever, I'm going to do a quick aside here. If you ever want to know what the Ark of the Covenant looked like, or looks like, I suppose it could still exist somewhere, go watch Raiders of the Lost Ark. They did a really, really good job of following the biblical pattern when they built the ark for that movie. It's very good. But it has these two cherubim, these angelic figures on top. And the one that I'd never picked up on before until I was reading the book is when they got kicked out of Eden. Let's go to Genesis 3. 3:24, he drove out the man at the east of the Garden of Eden. So when he got kicked out of Eden, he went out to the east. So on the east side of Eden is where the entrance is. And temple and tabernacle always faced east, so you had to enter them from the east. I'd never picked up on that before, but I read some scholars and they said this is an Edenic figure for the Israelites of the time. They would have picked up on that. So in the midst of Israel's camp, while they are learning to be different than the world, there is this holy place. And they live in proximity to God. Out there is bad, is evil, is world, is unholy. But in here, in the place where God lives, in the place where Israel lives, it's holy. And I'm going to show you that. Leviticus 16, and this is more or less where we'll spend the rest of our time with what little of it we have. The Day of Atonement. In Hebrew, this is Yom Kippur, and we still, on our calendar, sometime in September, if your calendar marks such things, you'll see Yom Kippur. That's the Day of Atonement. It's the day when Israel, as a community, atoned for their sins. And this is how they did it. Jump down to verse 7. Then he, that's Aaron, shall take 2 goats and set them before Yahweh at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, one lot for Yahweh and the other for, and it depends on what translation of the Bible you're using. Mine says Azazel. Some of your older translations, King James, maybe New King James, maybe New American Standard, I'm not sure, will say for a scapegoat. The Hebrew word there is Azazel. And it is placed in parallel with Yahweh. One goat is for Yahweh, and one is for Azazel. Grammatically, with those 2 words being in parallel, you would expect them to both be the same kind of word. And since we know Yahweh is a proper name, it would follow that Azazel is probably a proper name. And of course, there's long tradition of us translating this as scapegoat. But that doesn't really fit what's going on here. And particularly since we have discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have learned more about how the Jews read some of these texts. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in non-biblical texts, because the Old Testament never says this, but we know that the Jews read it this way, the first century Jews read it this way. Azazel was the name of a demon. An evil spiritual being. In fact, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls that talks about him says that he was, in fact, the leader of the angelic beings in Genesis 6, when the sons of God saw the daughters of man were attractive and they came down and had babies with them. Now, that is not Bible. But that's what the Jews believed, and when they would go back and read these texts, that's the stuff that was going through their heads. So, let's think about the implications of what's going on here on Day of Atonement. I'm going to have to talk fast to get all this in. There's the 2 goats. There's the one for Yahweh that is sacrificed to Yahweh. And then there is this other goat that is not sacrificed. Israel never makes sacrifices to other gods. Well, she's not supposed to. She messes up every now and then. But God says, this other goat, Aaron lays his hands on the goat. He transfers all the sins of the nation to that goat. And then they don't kill it. They throw it out into the wilderness. They give it back to Azazel, the demon that lives out there in the unholy place where evil and sin and all that kind of stuff exists. The sin is put on the goat is thrown out of the camp of Israel. You get the sin out of the holy place. You keep the holy place clean by getting all the sin out, and you send sin back where it belongs, to the realm of the fallen, the realm of the evil, the realm of the demons. That's how Jews would have heard what was going on in this passage, and certainly later Jews, we have some of their records, again, Dead Sea Scrolls, but particularly when you get into the time of the writing of the New Testament, these are the ideas that first century Jews would have when they go back and read these ancient texts. And I think I already said all of this stuff. The goat for Azazel was not a sacrifice. I said all that. So, why all of this matters? Because God is other. God is different. And to enter the presence of God, Israel had to be purified. Their sins had to be gotten rid of. And it's still the same for us. To enter into God's presence, we must be purified. Fortunately for us, that was handled at the cross. And so this idea that God is teaching Israel about holy place and sin is outside the holy place, that still applies to us. Hopefully that's an idea that Israel learned and now we live by. We just don't have to do a sacrifice every year to do it. We don't have to send a goat out into the realm of evil because our sins were taken away from us by Jesus' action on the cross. But again, it's all because of the nature of God, His otherness, His holiness, His cleanliness. 1 John 3:5. You know that He appeared in order to take away sins, and in Him there is no sin. And because the sins are taken away, we are now a holy place. We are now sacred space. Romans chapter 8. You, however, are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. If, in fact, the Spirit of God lives in you. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to Him. But if Christ is in you, although the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. If the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, He who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through His Spirit who dwells in you. We, as God's people, are now the holy place. We are the temple. Paul even uses that language in Corinthians. We are the place where God lives. And we don't bring sin and corruption and decay and death into holy place because it doesn't exist where God is. And in all fairness, that explains this really, really weird passage over in 1 Corinthians 5. He's talking about the guy, 1 Corinthians 5, for a man has his father's wife. They're tolerating this in the church. He says down in verse 5, you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, so that his spirit may be saved. Do you hear what Paul is saying? There is sin in the church. You got to throw it out to where sin belongs. You've got to deliver him to Satan. You've got to put that goat and send it out into the realm of the demons. He's doing the same thing with the church in Corinth that Israel did with the goat that had all the sins on it. They're throwing it out into the place where sin is supposed to be. And sin is not supposed to be in a holy place. It's the exact same action. One's done with a goat, one's done with a sinful person. But understanding the holiness of God helps us to see what's going on in that particular little bit of weirdness. I'm going to close with Colossians 1. Pay real close attention to the tense of the verbs here. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness. That's past tense. It's over and done with. We were in that dark place where sin lives, and has transferred us, again, past tense, it's done, to the kingdom of His beloved Son. in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. We lived out there in that fallen area, that realm of demons, the world, the corruption. We lived there, but God has taken us out of that and transferred us to this holy place where we now live. And he did that through what Christ did. And so God's otherness is still a thing for us. God's sacred space is still a thing for us. It's the world we live in as Christians. We live in sacred space. We are sacred space. And so we need to treat it as such. That's why we don't go around actively sinning, because we live in a holy place. Okay, questions or comments? Alrighty. We'll pick up here next week and do another chapter.